That's what's got to be in it.
What?
The Capitol Dome.
On paper?
I want to make that come to life for every boy in this land. Yes, and all light it up like that, too. You see, boys forget what their country means by just reading The Land of the Free and history books. When they get to be men, they forget even more. Liberty's too precious a thing to be buried in books, Miss Saunders. Men should hold it up in front of them every single day of their lives and say, I'm free to think and to speak. My ancestors couldn't, I can. And my children will.
So that was a scene from Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, and I'm here with Mark Borchardt, and you're listening to My Dinner with Gabe, our election edition, where we watched several movies, and we'll talk about different movies related to the subject of electoral politics, would you say, Mark?
Politics in general, potentially.
Yeah. And that, I imagine Mr. Smith Goes to Washington is almost like It's a Wonderful Life. It's one of those films that almost everyone's seen.
Well, probably not, but almost everyone's heard of, you know.
Yeah, that's probably a better way of putting it.
We're getting closer to the truth, possibly, with that sentiment.
And it is interesting when you think about this, It's a Wonderful Life. That's also a Jimmy Stewart.
Yeah, Mr. All-American, absolutely.
Yeah. There's something about Jimmy Stewart that he's a little bit like the Norman Rockwell of cinema, except that the idea of Norman Rockwell is less well observed by the art community because art is an elite kind of thing.
Well, first of all, your erudite observations are immediately coming into play, and that's a stunning allegory. Here's Jimmy Stewart and Norman Rockwell, the Jimmy Stewart the Norman Rockwell of cinema. So congratulations already on kicking this off to a great start, Zav. And I was just also thinking about Norman Rockwell, that his time is yet to come, as you say, that the art world is elitist milieu, and certainly it is in the sense that the status of Norman Rockwell is reflected in that thinking, as you know, he's just taken for granted, and he's not like a Thomas Hart Benton, you know, or you know, the Romantic period of the early 1800s or so forth of American painting. And I mean, Norman Rockwell, he is one of our top artists, and his recognition is yet to be received. And back to Jimmy Stewart, what's interesting is that him being the Norman Rockwell of cinema, it's fitting because Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, of course, plays upon that small town naivete of him coming into Washington and being bombasted by its cynical environment.
And just kind of finishing up that idea, why painting, and I don't know if I'll be able to answer the question I'm asking, why painting has that kind of is viewed in a different light than cinema. That cinema is able to be a little bit schmaltzier, a little bit more for just kind of the everyday person, and art is something that's in museums, that hangs on walls, and maybe for some reason something to do with that does not lend it as well to being poppy. If I guess I'm trying, like mainstream poppy art isn't given the same kind of value. Validity.
Tell it the Roy Lichtenstein, man. No.
Well, Roy Lichtenstein takes that poppy art, like, you know, Batman comics, which are done by great artists. You know, a lot of the best artists in school end up making things like Batman comics when you're a kid, but then they're not taken seriously by the elite sort of museum world.
Whoa! I think there's maybe potentially an error in that. He's First of all, if you look at the fiscal value of his work, or obviously Warhol's work, which is
Right.
basically, in a sense, through the roof, that in the art world, I mean, they're aligned along the same value as the old masters, abstract expressionism, and
Yeah.
so on and so forth. I mean, Lichtenstein and Warhol and
Oh yeah.
they all fall in line. I mean,
Sure.
in a tone of reverence with the others.
Well, what I'm saying is that Lichtenstein takes the work of
Right,
someone like
appropriates
Stan Lee
Correct.
or whoever he chooses, whatever comic he chooses to grab, and he rarefies it and makes it into this sort of highbrow, high art in a sense. But before that, it's just in the funny pages. It's just something that people are dismissive of. On the other hand, the money-wise, financially, someone like Stan Lee might be richer than Roy Lichtenstein, as far as we know.
It's quite possible. I mean, obviously with his with the Marvel franchise headed to the big screen, yeah, you're right. That's huge. And now, how the heck did we get here?
Or even The Simpsons. Yeah, I'm sorry, I took us off on a tangent here because we're talking about electoral films about the elections. So, one thing about Mr. Smith Goes to Washington is that the basic message of the film seems to be that there's corruption in politics. That's part of the reality that we all have to deal with. That within the let's say it's baked into the recipe of democracy to have corruption in a sense.
Well, it's where the rivers flow easiest. You know, once you get it to a familiarity with a certain path and certain shortcuts, those by human nature start to come into place.
Right.
So you can't be so naive to think that everything is pure and picture perfect, you know,
Right.
because there's these systems that begin to identify themselves as, hey, this is the way to do it, and it may not be the most legitimate or so on and so forth, but it works. And then
Yeah.
obviously it begins to be taken advantage of by
Yeah.
certain entities, and then you run into problems.
Do you think that this film is ultimately cynical or ultimately?
No, it's not. It's impossible to be
optimistic.
cynical, because what it does is he gets to Washington and, you know, obviously has these very, I guess, say, naive notions and so on and so forth. We'll skip over that, and he gets cut right to the chase. If he gets, you know, obviously surrounded by these veterans of the political environment, and they're you know, corrupt and so on and so forth. But it's not a cynical film, because remember, Stewart embarks on this like eternal filibuster, you know, and he's
Yes.
about to physically collapse, and the one who actually turns the tide is this
Right.
20-year-old, he's been in politics for 20 years, and he's one of the henchmen to the villain of the piece, and he actually sheds his skin that he's worn all the time of corruption, and comes to the aid of Stewart.
Right.
And not only that, his personal secretary, who immediately foreshadows all this cynicism. She also, when he's about to quit, she's the one who says, "No, don't quit. You know, you've got to fight for what you believe in." So it's not cynical, because it actually takes these hardened veterans and they reemerge as these good guys in the end, and
Right.
come to his aid.
I have to say, I think that when I watch the film, I feel as though, you know, this little twist, it's almost like a Deus ex machina happens.
You're absolutely correct, because he's about to physically collapse.
He does collapse.
Right, and then, but you're right. That all of a sudden it's kind of like this. Potentially, it's this. This saving grace is obviously unexpected and almost unrealistic, because
Right.
he could have been now. Hey, he collapses, though the war is won. You know, we've got rid of him, and as you
Yeah.
say, all out of the blue, that this plot device
I hate
appears.
to say it, but in real life, he would have collapsed, and that guy would have probably felt really bad about it and not done anything
But I agree and I disagree because there are so many shades of the human personality, and this is actually this one time that this hardened veteran actually, it's his point where he can make a decision again to go to the better side of life, and you're right in one sense, but on the other sense is that the personalities reemerge, or they need to come back into life, and that was the pivotal point for that guy. And so Stewart is saved. So yeah, it could go either way, definitely.
I mean, I'm just thinking about Scott Walker, and I'm thinking about the protests in Madison, and seeing the Republicans, the way that they function to do everything. I mean, they almost are like the villains in Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. It's so obvious to so many people what's happening, and this is the other thing, is that we forget that whenever there is a cynical kind of, I don't think Scott Walker is evil. I think he's just part of a system, but I do think that the final results of a lot of his practices are hurting families, hurting Americans. It's certainly not fair play. Something very, very unsavory is happening in Madison. But at the same time, there's the flip side of it. There's probably half of Wisconsin really does support Scott Walker and really does see these teachers as being a bunch of corrupt, people with Cadillac healthcare plans, and so like probably in reality, I mean, in the film, he receives all of these. What do they call those again? They're like little pieces of paper that are the way that people used to send messages electronically. Telegrams. Yeah, there's baskets of telegrams deriding Jimmy Stewart for holding up the Senate, and blocking the government for 72 hours or whatever it is. And I think in reality, you'd have a lot of people who are really pissed off at that character. So. I'm just imagining how this sort of fairy tale really plays out in real life politics. Maybe I'm the cynic. I'm being cynical right now and saying that I think that film would have had not a happy ending. It would have ended badly for Jimmy Stewart in real life. That's my impression.
It's a roll of the dice. I think, and I think we've illuminated those options. But God bless you, Zav. You are a heck of a host. No, I mean, you have the ability to maintain a robust conversation, to keep it on its legs, and moving you. I mean, there's no shortage of idea coming from you, and that's a great thing. And now, so let me all of a sudden grab the reins while there's this pocket of silence and say All the President's Men. Just an amazing film, and it concerns. It was Carl Bernstein and Bob Woodward, the Cub Washington Post reporters who fell into the Watergate scandal and were preeminent in exposing it and so forth. Because a lot of papers, they didn't take it very seriously. And it was kind of like Watergate was a building thing. It didn't just happen in June 1972. It was just a small story, but nonetheless a suspicious story that continued to grow wings and ultimately take flight into this national disaster.
Here you can say, okay, now this is a kind of a Mr. Smith Goes to Washington type of story.
But they're already in Washington.
But yeah, and this is more it's about reporters. It's about the media, but it's a true story. And, and it actually does have. It is a true story that has a sort of you could say a happy ending for the protagonists, right?
Yeah, I get. I mean, they succeed in their case. They've exposed the not as well scandal all the way up to the top, where Nixon, gets out of the White House, via the helicopter. Actually can remember that, man, as a kid. I don't have a lot of memories, but I remember in the family living room and the comment of it all and seeing it. So, but I read the book, and it is one of the most, or for me, the most suspenseful book that I've ever read. It is just fascinating, man.
Is it who's it written by?
Carl Bernstein and Bob Woodward.
Oh, okay.
It's written by them, absolutely.
And in fact, the book, if I remember correctly, Robert Redford read the book and said we need to put this on film. Was that what it was?
It seems like most likely that Robert Redford was the helm of that idea. I'm sure I've read about it, but I'm not that intimate with it. I know that Redford kind of had this triad of political films, 3 Days at a Condor, All the President's Men, and The Candidate, and each fascinating in its own right. And All the President's Men is just got that great 70s set of the newspaper room, just fantastic.
Yes.
Like in Zodiac, it's a San Francisco paper. They have that great set of the newsroom. And I want to point out, like when we talk about Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, there was an acceptance of theatricality in films in those days. I think that film had separated itself from real life, as in the portrayal of persona. It's like, well, we're not really here to see real people act out their lives. We're here to see actors, and actors are a bit theatrical. And so that was accepted. I mean, which is not a good thing, because theatricality works when you're Peter Lorre, Sidney Greenstreet, Humphrey Bogart, and Noir, because then it's a joy to see that. But when you are trying to accept that these are real people and they're still acting theatrical, that doesn't work. I mean, Olivier, like in Hamlet, that kind of theatricality again works, but you don't put that stuff into 60s and 70s film where you're trying to have this realistic situation where Robert Redford, in that in All the President's Men, everything is it's tried to be enacted as realistic as possible, that these are real people and we're watching a fairly real situation. So
but is it? I mean, okay, so what you're saying
there's a change in style, there's a change in acceptance of what's acceptable, as in the portrayal of actors.
It's an interesting thing. I marvel at actors' ability to seem realistic, in a sense. Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah.
Realism versus
theatricality.
Theatricality, sort of a
theatricality can be a real turnoff. I mean, again, if it's trying an attempt to portray real people and be theatrical, that it just does not age well. It does not come off right, even at the time. And I guess why this is brought up, because with Robert Redford and so forth, and having just seen The Candidate again, there's that emphasis on trying to remain as real as possible, and it's an absolute joy to watch. Therefore, never ages, because how can reality age? It can't.
Yeah, or
portrayal of reality can. Interpretation of reality can age, but not reality itself.
Yeah, that's true. When something is genuine, it's timeless in a sense.
Thank you.
And I'm not sure. Yeah, that's you could talk about that on a lot of levels with this kind of cinema. That's what's great about films that don't attempt to bend further than, for example, when someone makes a film and in the film things are the way they just are in the natural environment. The film basically brings a natural environment onto the screen. At the time, it might be sort of humdrum to the audience, but in the future tense, it's like you're visiting this paradise, this other time that's been captured on film. Sometimes you'll see that happen where people will a film like from the 80s, for example. In the 80s, people really liked to, what was the word that they used a lot? It was magical realism, or sorry, I have an itchy throat. Heightened reality, where things were augmented, where they put shoulder pads in people's jackets, and they sort of pushed reality beyond itself, and at the time it was sort of exciting because it was this sort of exciting heightening of reality, but then in retrospect it ages a lot. It looks sort of
Wait, what do you mean by
old.
putting pad now? When you talk about putting pads in people's shoulders, that's
Or
the
for
1940s.
example, using
Yeah.
colored lights, extreme, using a lot of colored lights.
That might actually fall to bad lighting, man.
Yeah.
Well, actually, broadcast news. I think that's from '89. Decent film, but the costumes and hairstyles are horrific. It's like a nightmare. You know, and so that's something.
Yeah, I'm thinking of like Desperately Seeking Susan, where they were trying to kind of give you some noir qualities in the 80s. They were hearkening to some of that with like this Chinese restaurant motif in the background where the character lived, but they weren't doing it all the way. People had these hairdos where it's like dyed hair, but you can just, all of it sort of aged poorly.
Yeah, I mean, I saw that film, and but that was quite a while ago. But I am kind of teetering on getting what you're saying.
That there's a certain
amplification of the era.
Yeah. That era in particular, people were taken by this notion of amplifying reality in a sense, and like if you were in a room, there would be a green light in the corner, and they would just make it extra green, and everything was kind of extra big, extra colorful, and it kind of aged poorly in a sense. But at the time, it was probably like, oh, that's so cool,
Absolutely.
It's always dangerous to take a newfangled idea too far before you've lived with it and kind of learned that it's just a trope. It's not a thing in itself. It's not very substantive. It's actually just kind of shallow. But it gives the impression of big.
Yeah, and I think that's a heck of an insight. And I was actually just looked up the word trope, I think, yesterday, and it's something. I don't know if I'm even remembering it quickly, as an idea that is not equal to its literal equivalent, something like that. I don't know. You would know. You're the user.
I might be wrong in my use of it, but it's like a trick, basically. It's something that kind of tricks you. It's like a it's a little bit of it's misleading in it gives you the impression of being something that it's not, kind of.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So read the book, All the President's Men. Just a great, compelling book. What a fun thing to read. And if you're reading that also, Hunter Thompson's Fear and Loathing on the Campaign Trail '72. It's dense, but you can read it in chunks. That's a fun read.
And is there any relation to Fear and Loathing in
no, Las Vegas?
Vegas?
Because he's on the campaign trail in '72, so it's all political, that particular book. So just that's a fun read. That and All the President's Men, read that because it's fun. It's educational and fun. You can't beat it with a stick.
Well, what are some comparisons between the book and the movie? What are some things that you got from the book?
Well, in the book, obviously, is the density of the information that you wouldn't get on the screen, and the information in of itself is absolutely fascinating, which is not in the film.
Right.
The film is an entertainment, 2 hours or whatever the running time is. It actually, it was up for Best Picture in '76, which Rocky won that year, but also was Network, I believe, was up for Best Picture too, which also has a brilliant film with its political asides and so forth too. So it's from that year '76. But yeah, the book, obviously, it has its own being with a lot more informative texture to it, and but it doesn't bog you down with it's not details that are irrelevant. It's all combines to have into a spellbinding brew. So both the film and the book are brilliant.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm not much of a read. I don't get a chance to read much, but it sounds. Here's one of the things about the Watergate issue, the Watergate debacle, that I've never completely. It's a story that I've never completely gotten my head around, and it's interesting. Like, you know, watching All the President's Men, it's compelling, it's exciting, but I still come away from it not knowing exactly what exactly. You know, yes, there was this malfeasance. They were they were raiding the Democratic headquarters and sort of fixing the game in a sense, trying to, but then isn't that something that all, I think they even say it in the movie, like it happens all the time. Everybody does that.
Right, but it's all to relative degrees. And the thing with Watergate, its tentacles had stretched back in history far before the actual break-in and so forth. And one of the, obviously, the mysteries of the break-in were these burglars operating on their own accord, which is fairly ridiculous. They were dressed in suits. They already had lawyers lined up, and all of that information began to say that, they were operating in a much broader, within a much broader system. Obviously, all the way ultimately to the top, into the White House. But they had done. There was just some nefarious stuff, I think, with the Daniel Ellsberg. They wanted to firebomb his office, actually. Nixon may have actually wanted that to happen. When that happened, so a standing president, then you get into Crazyville.
Wait, so this is that was revealed in the movie?
Not in the film. No, not in the movie. In real life, that these tentacles were kind of like everywhere, and it involved.
Wait, Daniel Ellsberg. Now he
was a psychiatrist that actually. I think he served in Vietnam, and he had actually gotten access to the Pentagon Papers. The Pentagon Papers is a survey of the Vietnam War by our government, and they were basically saying that this is an unwinnable mess, and Nixon didn't want that to get into the public sphere, that these papers illuminated that fact. But Daniel Ellsberg, he went ahead and made a copy of it.
Right, and Daniel Ellsberg has been... there's been a lot of allusions or connections between Daniel Ellsberg and Julian Assange. Daniel Ellsberg stands up. He does a lot of... he makes a lot of
correlations
between the two events, between WikiLeaks now and the Pentagon Papers then, so it's interesting to think about Julian Assange being, maybe today people have mixed feelings about him. They don't know what to think. It was probably true about Daniel Ellsberg at the time too, that he, people thought of him as a someone who was a rat or like a fink or something, and
depending on which side of your fence, a traitor or a hero.
Yeah, like
that dichotomy,
like a traitor or a hero, and then the other one is the My Lai massacre, which was Seymour Hersh. Those are some of the big exposés or exposures that brought down the Nixon administration, or brought Vietnam to an end in a sense.
It's all tough territory, because in one sense the public wants to know and potentially has a right to know what the government's doing. On the other hand, the government saying, hey, we got to keep we make mistakes, or we got to keep some of these things secret because it's in our best interest to keep moving along with the program till we get this accomplished. So I mean, you have that equivalency you're continually dealing with, I mean,
and then there's straight up corruption.
Absolutely.
There's all kinds of dirty dealings going on.
Absolutely.
And that's maybe more than people would want to believe. That's a little bit what Jimmy Stewart's experience is we have this idea of what our democracy is and how our country works, and I'm sure this is true in every country, not just America, and we get taught it in schools, and that's kind of what Jimmy Stewart was talking about at the beginning of our show.
But let me, I'm sorry for interrupting, Zab, but when you talk of something like cynicism, isn't that a shade of ignorance? Because as soon as you understand or begin to understand that there are, corrupt venues in the system. You can't keep calling it cynicism. It just becomes a reality that you have to deal with and then potentially correct.
Sure.
So, I mean, you can
In
only
fact,
remain.
that's what democracy is.
You can only remain cynical for so long before you're the problem, because it needs to at some point overturn into reality, and then you deal with that reality. Cynicism is like, oh, I just found this out. This is not nice. Oh, it makes me think differently of the situation.
Yeah.
Well, now that you found that out, you should become then, instead of a cynic, a realist, and deal with it and do what you think you need to do to correct the situation.
Yeah, it's a little bit like, let's say, dealing with a drug addict, where the person, first of all, you think the person's just like any old person, then you realize they're stealing your money, and then you realize, well, you could just be like, oh, that person sucks, and I just want them to just disappear or something. Or you can say, well, this person is correct. We can do something about this. We can try to, like, they need to, like, come to some, like, this is a disease, and there are ways to cure this disease, or there are not ways to cure this disease. Regardless, you have to face the fact. You can't pretend that this person's not a drug addict anymore. In a sense, that's how we have to look at government, is to say, okay, we could go right to the elections coming up. I think a lot of Americans, in fact, I heard today on the news that 1/3 of America is voting independent right now. Is like that, if you could have an independent voter, or an independent running for office, 1/3 of Americans would vote for that independent. And they say that in the future it'll even be more extreme. And I think they're drifting away from, this was on NPR, according to the thing I heard, more people are drifting away from the Democratic Party, but that's also going to happen with the Republican Party. So in other words, the point is that you have an election coming up you have two choices, Obama and Romney, but obviously 1/3 of Americans are completely disenchanted with the system because the person they want to vote for isn't even available to vote for them.
Yep. Well, that's life, because it's a huge system, and campaigns take a huge amount of money, and there's infinite spheres of influence that are incalculable. So hey, man, that's life. You just gotta press on, and as a member of the citizenry, you should do your part. And watching TV and so forth doesn't help. I mean, are you doing something about it that enables your thinking?
Or I mean, in some cases, Americans are, people say, people are ignorant, but it's actually people are highly informed. But the problem is that their information can be very suspect.
Well, dude, man. Now this word comes up, and we got to get back to films. But wait a second, man. If you're watching TV, you're not being informed. Come on, man. That's what a third grader does. You should be getting astute and erudite periodicals that actually have realistic data that your mind should be able to assemble. Because what the television and radio does a quick assemblage of almost non-information. It's just kind of like an entertainment. Mm-hmm. So you're basing your emotions off this entertainment that you're being informed by, which is ridiculous. I mean, if you had any real interest in politics, you would find out further what the real deal is, which is far beyond mass media.
Right.
So you not you personally, but you in general have only yourself to blame.
Right.
You're choosing to be entertained instead of spending hours a day finding out good, real information that can actually be used.
Yeah. And getting back to the Jimmy Stewart view of America, I mean, I feel like that was a different time. It was a completely different time period. It's almost hard to imagine living in that time period when I see it. It's so, I mean, Frank Capra he's such a great film director. It's like he's so entertaining. But there are just the most bizarre things happening in that film. Like, for example, in Washington, I had no idea that children would play a role in the Senate.
You mean the pages?
Yeah, that you'd have these children running around calling the senators into the whatever the room, the chamber, and children probably running around getting coffee and doing these things. This must have been before some certain kinds of child labor laws or something.
Yeah, if that was an actual fact, I mean, you haven't heard about pages for a while,
Yeah.
They exist, and we're saying back in this film they're exceptionally and surprisingly young.
Yeah, that's one interesting aspect. The idea of a father having, what is it in this film? He has probably 8 sons or something like that. A father sitting at a table with 8 sons at the table. I mean, I'm sure that everything's exaggerated. It's a movie, but that exaggeration is based on something real, And I remember going to school with kids where they would be the 7th or 8th or even sometimes 11th or 12th kid in the family.
Yeah, that's completely amazing, and I think the economy, though, back then enabled it because you had all of these farming communities where an abundance of children, hey man, they worked the fields, they did chores, and nowadays, of course, each child, you got to clothes, which costs money, beyond the sackcloth they wore. No, they didn't, but you know what I'm saying. It was like it didn't really cost to have that much children. Plus, they were out in the fields working the farm. They were an asset. The
Exactly.
More
Children
kids,
were
the better, man. It
more
expanded
kids
the
were
empire.
In a farm, in an agrarian society, more children are an asset. In an urban setting, more children are a deficit.
And it's extremely costly. I mean, there wasn't like back in the 20s or 30s in particular communities. The child didn't worry about wearing the latest fashion or so, which would deplete the parents' pocketbook. So it was an entirely different way of thinking back then.
Yeah. Was this based on? Do you know if Mr. Smith Goes to Washington was based on anything?
I'm clueless. I don't know.
I was wondering because there was the whole thing about they never mentioned the word Boy Scouts of America, but it was definitely referring to something like the Boy Scouts, and it seemed like Mr. Smith wanted to create something like the Boy Scouts of America. That was my sense of it. It was almost like the original idea. But then we saw kids, and I'm pretty sure Boy Scouts of America have been around for a long time.
I almost see Boy Scouts of America, maybe, I was going to say England, but you say Boy Scouts of America. I hear the name Baden or something, but we might be thinking about something entirely different if the Boy Scouts were created in America or they came over from England. I might be just totally off the mark. But there might be a reason, too, like the Boy Scouts didn't want to be identified in the film or
exactly.
so on.
Maybe they were skirting around using the name Boy Scouts.
Yeah, who knows?
Anyway, for people who are listening, maybe I should just quickly explain what that's about. That Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, he's an unsuspecting hero of the community. People know him for having saved someone's life. You don't get to see that part in the film. And then he's sort of like someone who is elected senator by true popularity. People really just love this person, as opposed to because he's a shrewd politician. He's not a politician at all. Then he becomes senator because the standing senator suddenly dies or something like that. And the thing he wants to implement is this sort of like Boy Scout camp. And then that's what leads into the whole corruption because the evil guy, I forget his name, wants to create a mine there. And so anyway, that's why we're talking about Boy Scouts, because that's how the plot works.
Have you seen The Manchurian Candidate?
I have. It's been a long time, though, since I saw it.
And the reason why I bring that up, that's from '62, directed by John Frankenheimer, is that, when political films are brought up, that's brought up, too, so I just thought I'd make mention of it. I mean, so if you want to see a great political thriller, a psychological Cold War thriller,
very much
see
a
The
paranoid
Manchurian
feeling.
Yeah, just incredible with... I think Darren McGavin, The Night Stalker, and Angela Lansbury. And it's a film you're going to need to see more than once.
And Frank Sinatra.
Yeah, Frank Sinatra is our protagonist. it's a film you're going to have to see more than once to kind of, begin to understand, the tentacles of its narrative, because it's just not a film you're probably going to get the first time. But the Manchurian Candidate 62, check
Did you
it out.
see the remake of it?
Yes, I did. Yes, I did.
And how does that stand against the original?
It's not bad, and there's remakes serve their own purpose in a sense. So, obviously see the original first.
Yeah.
And if you're into color and contemporaneous cinema, go see the remake. It's not bad.
Well, wasn't there? Now, I saw the Manchurian Candidate in probably the late '80s, early '90s, and it was in color. Was it colorized?
That's startling. No, it was black and white.
Really?
Yeah, I wonder if that Ted Turner had a hand in that.
I remember that it was a big deal that they were releasing it in color.
Wow, that's
That maybe
bizarre.
there was a color version that had never been put out.
I mean, a color version, you mean shot at the time?
Yeah.
I find that hard to believe. There's been no mention of it. It must have been colorized.
Maybe it was colorized.
Yeah.
But I remember it was highly acclaimed. It was a little bit around the same time that they were re-releasing Rear Window and some other Hitchcock films, also in color, that hadn't been re-released.
Yeah, that probably would be that's like Vertigo, Rear Window, Rope, Dial M for Murder. I remember when there was a re-release of those at the theater.
Yeah. Anyway, a great film, the Manchurian Candidate.
And that obviously on the line soon we'll have to do a Hitchcock.
Yeah, that's a great idea, actually. Yeah, we've never done that.
I want to point out, I haven't seen it for a while, but Medium Cool is a great great film with a political slant. But again, it's been a while. I think they're actually shoot footage at the debacle in Chicago in '68 at the Democratic Convention. So that's something to check out, is Medium Cool. I think it's directed by Haskell Wexler.
That sounds right.
Or at least shot by him, maybe made by him. And with starring Robert Forster of Jackie Brown fame. And I also want to bring up the Candidate. Have you seen that, Zav?
Yes.
Yeah, that was a great film.
I saw The Candidate and All the President's Men.
Good work.
Sort of in sequence. I watched All the President's Men first, and then The Candidate second. And I have to say that the Candidate was far less compelling to me than All the President's Men. But that's not saying that's just saying a lot for All the President's Men. All the President's Men is an incredibly compelling film.
Yeah, there's a nonstop drive to the narrative with All the President's Men, but The Candidate has this kind of atmosphere of realism that it's not narratively like a storybook compelling, but it's compelling in the portrayal of certain aspects of reality. It's a different kind of compelling. And talk about a cynical film, boy, that Candidate leaves you dispirited about the whole thing, man.
Right. And again, very much along the same lines as Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, except that this, well, actually,
our naive hero gets thrown into the den of lions.
And isn't Mr. Smith also the son of a candidate? He is. I believe he is, because that's how he knows.
You mean, or a son of a former? His father was cast a big political shadow over. It was a former politician. You're saying?
Yeah.
Yeah, because like Redford is running for the Democratic ticket for U.S. Senate, and his father was the governor of California.
Right, and his father is part of the system. They're almost estranged. They're not really very close.
Correct.
They have a cold relationship.
Correct.
And his father at a certain point says, oh, don't worry about he says something, Robert Redford's character says, I'm worried that they're not getting my message. And then his father says, oh, don't worry about it. Nobody cares anyway.
Right.
But Robert Redford it really is part of that period of time. It's a very, it is, in a sense, there's a kind of naivete. It's a new kind of, it's a 60s, 70s type of naivete that came, I think, with the the young generation that was sort of creating a new revolution in America.
Yeah, and they wanted their voice heard, but their voice had no relevance in the system. They had concerns about the environment, about race, about poverty, and all of that stuff, and that just doesn't. That's an aside to the system. It's a thorn in the side of the system.
Yeah.
These guys have it rigged that this enables and benefits their desires who already have it made, and then they grudgingly have to contend with other people's problems,
Yeah, exactly.
And the youth at that time in the Cultural Revolution of the 60s wanted their voices heard, and their voices became louder, and that was that whole situation that came out of
the
that.
baby boom generation.
Right.
Which got completely, or maybe I shouldn't say completely, but it got folded into the system. With people like Bill Clinton is sort of typifies it, where he's a real baby boomer type of person. He is almost like the candidate. One of the candidate.
Well,
is a little more extreme.
It's neat that you pointed out. President Clinton's a lawyer as well, but I don't think he was a naive like Redford's character. There's different. I think Clinton's very sophisticated and knew the deal.
Clinton is a career politician, where Robert Redford is a reluctant politician.
Correct.
He's a politician against his own will almost. He's sort of like doesn't really want to be a politician, but then he just kind of gets thrown into it, just like Jimmy Stewart.
Yeah, he's forced into it.
And so the whole way he's stubborn, and he says, well, I'm not going to play the game. I'm not going to kiss these people's asses. I'm going to say what I want to say. I'm not going to worry about losing, no longer being, losing my candidacy or whatever. But little by little, he begins to get eaten up by the system. And at a certain point in the film,
all the while, though, it's accumulating interest, which allows him ultimately to win.
Right. So the thing that makes him be the candidate that people like is also starting to become more and more artificial, and because it's getting more popularity, it's gaining strength. And that it's a kind of paradox of life in a way.
Sure, and what's amazing, and then you bring it as it becomes enmeshed in the system. His syntax becomes exactly repetitive. I mean, he, instead of speaking his mind, he's just reiterating the same phraseology, man, over and over again. They do that in a clever kind of montage, and he kind of reaches a breaking point in the back of the car when he just sputtering this nonsense and so forth. Yeah, but he becomes the enabler of this repetitive this repetitive, ideology, and just use it, and they show it in the film, him using the exact same sentences over and over again now, instead of being allowing his own free will to expose itself. So he becomes victimized by that.
And what this tells me is there's this tension between democracy and how it functions in reality, in Washington, when the rubber meets the road, and what we all sort of aspire to as people. I feel that what these films say is we as people can look at government, look at the way things are being run, and we see the obvious falseness, the obvious fakery, and the stupidity,
right,
of things like going to war in Afghanistan, when our children are suffering from impoverished schools. Maybe that's just my perspective. Maybe someone else is sitting and looking and saying, why are we putting so much money into, or why are we allowing big government to control us, and we should have less government, that kind of thing. But anyway, the point is, there's this disconnect between what we all know to be kind of like how it could be, and how it is, and we want it to be the way it should be, but we don't know how to get there.
Well, yes, you do know how to get there because you have a pen and a piece of paper, and you make a list of your grievances, and you actually have to believe what you've just written down. You talk about impoverished schools. Well, then you need to do some comparative studies to what you think is a school that's well off and functioning well to one that is in disarray and disrepair, and you have to have this stuff in black and white and point this out, and you have to believe in it enough to be persistent. You know, it cannot just ride on an emotional tide.
Right.
It has to have some basis in actual. It has a very substantive and enduring quality until your issue gets resolved. You know,
Yeah.
and you need obviously to get more an increasing amount of people on board, so you have that battering ram that eventually pushes through the door of change and so forth. So again, it's on the populace and the citizenry to do their duty, because the politicians already have it. They know what they're doing to a T. They're eating well and they're sleeping well at night.
Yeah.
So if you ain't, it's now you need to do your thing.
Right. But I mean, don't you think that people feel like the reason these films work with people is because they feel that they see problems and they fantasize. And I saw this in Madison, where people fantasize that they can go to the Capitol and they can change this society, and yet, you know, we have this whole recall Walker thing happen, and it doesn't work. It doesn't work. He doesn't get recalled. Everything keeps going forward, despite people, you know, what seemed like an outpouring, a deluge.
But why shouldn't that outpouring though continue? And I mean, you don't need a mob of people is great because it calls infinite attention at that point in time to the cause. But just think if all of those same people were actually doing something on a daily basis, saying this politician's doing this one's doing that, and not in such a basic way, you know, like this one's good and this one's evil, but these are the points that we need addressed, and let's keep hammering away at them little by little until this change occurs. You know. Well,
what you're saying is very realistic.
Dude, I'm hungry. I have a plan. I potentially am going to go get a low-level pizza to eat just now. But if I was swayed by someone to go to, I don't drink, but go to the bar, if I did, blow that money, become drunk and disorientated and starving out on the streets.
Right.
No, dude, I'm going to go and get that pizza and satisfy this issue.
Right.
You see what I'm saying?
I see what you're saying, but I'm wondering why these narratives, why people desire a story about a guy who goes to Washington or a guy who becomes a politician and just does it the way he wants and says it like it is. My impression of it is that there's a lot of people out there who feel like that can never happen, and so it's a fantasy.
I love the word fantasy that you're using, because you're absolutely correct. Here, the television is on tonight, and people are at a bar drinking their beer, and I'm not going to say the B word that I was going to use because it says no profanity, so I'll use bemoaning about the situation. Dude, they're not the ones that are waking up Saturday morning, knocking on the doors, asking people to vote or asking about issues. So the fantasy enables them to be invalid or whatever, you know, so they just sit there and bemoan the whole thing because they sure as heck ain't going to go through the drudgery of knocking on the doors. And so don't complain that it doesn't work if you ain't the one knocking on the doors, if you ain't the one going to the meetings and getting pen to paper and making these lists and standing by them.
And in a sense, what these films are, to take your analogy further, is they're like films of getting pizza. They're like films of, wouldn't it be great if we got that pizza and how good it would taste? Because it's like the taste of finally getting a chance to tell it like it is. You know, have you ever? I mean, haven't you, when you've watched the debates or watched a politician, just wish they would for once just tell it like it is?
That's you know, again, I understand what you're saying, and there's that, you know, breakdown point as in network and the guy screaming out the window. Obviously, that's the emotional resolution. You know, telling it like it is also admitting that there's a huge system to work for, and telling it like it is might be fine, but how far is it really going to get you? Before, you know, you got to do the street work, man, to get to that point. Of, you know,
that nothing. It all takes effort. It all takes real energy
and belief, man. There's no.
You're
effort
telling it like it
is,
actually. You're telling it like it is, which is it's hard work.
Well, you're too kind.
Yeah, it's hard work, and it's not. It doesn't. It actually doesn't ever end. It's an eternal struggle.
Thank you.
That's
we
have an eternal
Tom.
struggle with power. That corruption is always a problem, and democracy, in a sense, that's what. Earlier on, I said that's what democracy is. Democracy, in a sense, is about just accepting that there's corruption. There is there are people who have really opposite interests than yours, and who basically are like your enemies. Like it's almost like a war, and they want to kill you. They want to kill your ideas, and you have to fight if you want your idea to live. You have to fight like a soldier. You know, fight to the death, in a sense.
What you're saying is very inspiring, and I want to, on a personal note, you know, I want to say that I was thinking about two people today, you and John Riepenhoff, who I had the great honor to have met outside here. And when I think about you and John Riepenhoff, I think about people who possess smart ideas and are of mutual benefit. That when we do something such as this radio show or an art show, photography exhibit with John and so forth, there's something of mutual benefit. The majority of people are takers. They've got these. When anyone that has an idea, run away from like they've got the plague, man, because that idea is for their sole benefit, and they're involving you and taking your time and so forth. So what I like about you guys who are in the 2%, and if we do. That it's of mutual. Our work is of mutual benefit. So this allies itself with you thinking about you saying it's hard work to to get your political narrative in motion and get somewhere with it, and then it should be of mutual benefit to the citizenry doing it instead of some guy sitting behind his desk and have others knock on doors or I mean, but obviously there's an echelon of power in any group and so on and so forth. But I did want to point out to you this idea of mutual benefit that you and John Riepenhoff continually bestow upon me. So thank you to you two.
Yeah, well, I don't think anyone, I mean, to add to the cynical sort of dialogue in certain ways, or the cynical, non-cynical, I don't think that I do anything that isn't a benefit to me unless it's a mistake.
Wait, you're saying what you do, you consciously know will be of benefit to you?
Yeah, in some way, right. I get something out of it.
Of course, it's self-survival.
I'm selfish. I'm as selfish as anyone else, is what I'm saying.
No. Selfish. You're using modesty as a veil. You're not selfish. You're self-conscious. You're aware of your needs. I mean, American Airlines or whatever will say if there's airline trouble, you put on the air mask before anyone else, so you can assist others to get it on. Because if you're passed out, you ain't going to be helped to no one.
Right.
Dude, if you don't maintain your own house, you ain't going to be a benefit to no one.
Right.
Take care of yourself first, obviously along with those you love and so forth, before you can go out and make these further contributions to society. Don't expend your own resources and find yourself flat on your back out on sidewalk, man, because all people do is walk right over you, and you'll be the only one to blame.
But Jimmy Stewart went ahead and did that. He put himself out, and in the end he basically sacrificed himself a little bit like Jesus, and and that's where I think the film could have ended very differently.
Sure.
He could have ended up looking like a fool,
Yep.
and gone home feeling completely cynical about politics.
But again, like I said, it's the shades of personality, because we really don't know what the other person's thinking. Sometimes your enemies become your friends become your enemies, so on and so forth. And that was kind of an indicator of that possibility.
Now I heard that the candidate there, someone came and told me that the candidate was that they were talking about doing an updated version of the candidate with Robert Redford.
Weird.
Where he's been in politics for years and years, you know, for 20, 30 years, and now he's this sort of, you know, corrupted old politician.
It'd be wonderful to see. I don't think anything's going to top the candidate because it hits all. It's relevant today in its issues as it was back then. I mean, it's the exact same issues all over again, the exact same situation.
Yeah, I mean, they're talking about the watershed. I mean, that's the main thing he's very concerned about. And these people are all about poisoning. You know, they're poisoning the environment, and they're saying, oh, these environmentalists are just a big pain in the butt. And it's really scary to see, like, wow, nothing's really changed.
Nothing has changed
since the 70s, you know, in this country. You think that people are evolving in some way, but it's kind of the same old story.
Yeah, but I think, as you said, this will go on infinitely. These issues, these hopes, these desires, these fears, euphorias. I mean, it's the nature of life. It's the footprints of life.
Yeah. Well, on that note, I think we should probably wrap it up. But is there any last things that we should say before we?
God bless you, Gabe. Thank you. Yeah. And Godspeed.
And next time we should have Gabe on the phone with us.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, thanks for tuning in, and talk to you next week.